Ponzi's triumph. In 1920, the world learned of a financial fraud run by its namesake, Charles Ponzi. Ponzi was eventually arrested, imprisoned, and then deported, and the mechanics of his scheme were widely publicized. Ponzi's profits were not actually profits at all, as prosecutors revealed, making his entire investment enterprise a swindle. The claim of returns of 50% every 90 days came merely from later investors' funds deceptively transferred to earlier ones. His plan, which appeared to his investors to be valid and trustworthy, was destined to fail his investors from an inevitable point when he could no longer find enough new investors, or if existing investors in large numbers withdrew their investment capital that was being depleted by his payouts. In the interim, before the reality would be revealed, the investors lived with the happy delusion that they had discovered a secure and lucrative opportunity, a deal of a lifetime. Ponzi deceitfully claimed that the extraordinary profits came from the purchase and resale of international postage coupons. He said he was ingeniously leveraging differences in currency values among countries, yielding a great profit margin on behalf of the investors. In fact, he did not do any such trades, at least that have been recorded, but his claim to be making highly profitable postage coupon trades provided the alleged source of the benefits for his investors. By claiming he was a trader of these coupons, he made the case that he needed the investors to supply him with funds to make the lucrative trades. He benefited from using investors' funds, while they benefited from his specialized trading knowledge and expertise. Mutual need was established for mutual benefit, and an external source for the benefit was provided. The basic requirements for a sale or for a swindle, as explained by Arthur Leff, were met. Even more pertinent to Leff's analysis, Ponzi had found a wellspring of money enabling him to operate the scam: the investors' own funds. Payments delivered as promised at the beginning drew in flocks of excited new investors, extending the life of the scam. The awesome power of the endless chain money transfer was demonstrated, sparking a mania of excitement and hope. When the Ponzi hoax occurred in Boston in 1920, census records show that Lee Mittinger was living in Brooklyn, New York, and working as an accountant. He was 25 years old and married. It would have been difficult for him, especially as an accountant, not to hear about the scam. Ponzi's outrageous claims to offer Wall Street-sized profits to his Main Street investors struck a chord in America, where popular resentment against the wealthy was rivaled only by envy. Mittinger later lived in Maine and likely knew about Charles Ponzi's trials and eventual imprisonment in Massachusetts. The mysteries of capital gains, margin lending, compound interest and dividends available to preferred shareholders and the elite were now opening up to the benefit of the laboring masses, Ponzi seemed to claim. His assertions were bolstered by the support he gained from at least one major newspaper. Several local banks backed his scheme and managed his funds. And, mirroring the power of wealth itself, regardless of its source, Ponzi's vast fund, about $250 million in today's currency, caused many to believe it was legitimate on its face. In truth, few on Main Street, USA, understood how any of the established rich and powerful in America gained their fortunes. The sheer scale of their fortunes exceeded the experience, understanding, or imagination of most people, who typically subsisted month to month. Ponzi's sudden and enormous financial success, therefore, provoked no special suspicions among his investors, only awe. Further, month after month, Ponzi did indeed fulfill his promise to pay the extraordinary returns to his investors using their own money. As to where Ponzi himself came up with the idea of his now iconic fraud, biographer Mitchell Zukoff connects the scheme to an earlier experience Ponzi had working as a bank manager in Montreal in 1907. The bank owner, Louis Zarossi, was found to be operating a, quote, robbing Peter to pay Paul fraud. He used customers' funds intended to be sent back to Italy to their families as the source for paying out coveted higher interest rates on customer savings. The normal rate paid on savings accounts was 2%. Zarossi announced he would pay 6%, and customers flocked to his bank. To make up the difference, he began tapping into the money his customers entrusted the bank to send to families in Italy. Zarossi expected enough of a time interval between funds not arriving in Italy and the local customers making a complaint, during which he could refund the lost funds with new deposits coming from other customers. Zarossi's scheme was exposed, costing Ponzi his job. Ponzi was investigated for possibly being a part of the swindle. Even if Charles Ponzi were not inspired by the Zarossi bank fraud of 1908, his work experience in banking might have also provided some basis for his own scam. Banks routinely and legally make loans in excess of the total funds on hand. They back their loans with funds that amount to only a fraction of what they loan out. Banks' sustainability depends, as did Zarossi's and Ponzi's, on a time factor and other contingencies. Banks rely on depositors not seeking withdrawals in large numbers, and the margin of reserves needed for expected withdrawals and interest payments being always replenished by current or new depositors. The system also depends on the expected ability of debtors to repay their bank loans. If a large number of loans were not repaid, the bank would collapse, as it would in the face of large or sudden withdrawals. At all times, loans are not secured with full cash, and all depositors' cash is not actually available. The ever-astute Charles Ponzi, as a bank manager, may have observed that banks legally rob Peter, a margin of deposit funds they don't actually possess, to pay Paul, interest payments and profit-making loans. Though some economists consider the model unsustainable and unfair, it is the predominant legal form of banking across the world. For his 1920 scheme, Ponzi was never charged by federal authorities for operating a robbing Peter to pay Paul scam. He was arguably the first financier to operate such a scheme at this scale. Lacking a clearly defined violation of existing law, federal authorities found evidence that he had used the Postal Service in a deceptive manner. The charges were minor against the scale of his scheme, but sufficient to destroy public confidence. Ponzi was forced to plead guilty, leading to several years in federal prison, but on his release, the state of Massachusetts brought larceny charges against him, which required more direct proof that his investment proposition, which he advertised as the Ponzi plan, really was a fraud. Ponzi could not afford legal representation, and he was not an attorney. He represented himself. A jury of his peers found Charles Ponzi innocent on all counts. The state brought a second trial, resulting in a hung jury. He was finally found guilty only when the state persisted with a third trial. Whatever else the Ponzi prosecution disclosed about a new type of financial fraud, the larger revelation was about the minds of its victims and the response of the public at large, including some jurors. Ponzi's proposition of lucrative and unending returns both captivated and confounded the public's imagination. Ponzi had found an external source of wealth that he could promise to his investors and in fact deliver for a time. As Arthur Leff explained, all successful sales and swindles must be able to explain the source of the benefit being offered. The money for current investors, as the authorities sought to explain to the public, was an illusion. Overall, it was merely a portion of the investors' own money being returned to some of them as illusory profit. The inherent fraudulence of such a transfer plan seemed to elude many people. Proof of the cultural influence of Ponzi's new form of profit-making, transferring funds from later investors to earlier ones in an endless chain, is undeniably demonstrated in the many new opportunities and venues for this same fraud today. Bernard Madoff's fraudulent hedge fund was essentially a carbon copy of Ponzi's 1920 scheme, except that Madoff claimed to be trading Wall Street stocks using a secret strategy called split strike conversion. In fact, just like Ponzi, he was not making any trades at all, just transferring money from later investors to earlier ones. The payments were coming from the investors' own funds in aggregate. Madoff's Wall Street Ponzi, 80 years later, was able to draw in professionally managed pension funds, large institutional investors, and his own friends and family members. Reflecting the gathering momentum of Ponzi's influence, Madoff's fraud continued to operate for 15 years. In his book, The Ponzi Factor, The Simple Truth About Investment Profits, author Tan Lu debunks the widely held misconception that Ponzi schemes are inherently short-term. Lu persuasively argues that much of the stock market today is defined and characterized by what he calls the Ponzi factor, an internal money transfer model disconnected from true profits gained in the external marketplace. Share price depends on continuous infusion from later investors. Lu notes that many of the highest valued stocks, such as Tesla, have no recorded profits at all. Many stocks, even when they are exceptionally profitable, such as Facebook and Warren Buffett's fund, do not share the profits and dividends distributed to shareholders. Madoff's scheme was better executed than Ponzi's, but was still vulnerable to the threat of sudden and significant withdrawals. When the overall stock market crashed, along with real estate values in 2008, many of Madoff's investors suddenly needed cash and asked for withdrawals, prompting the scheme's exposure and collapse. Madoff's alleged source of funds, ingenious stock trading, was invented. It was as financially impossible for Madoff to have delivered consistent, above-average returns from making actual trades in the stock market year after year as it was for Ponzi to pay 50% quarterly from trading postage coupons. It was later revealed that even if Madoff operated his fraudulent hedge fund entirely by himself, many of his peers and colleagues on Wall Street facilitated the fraud with their complicit silence, rationalizing that exposure might shake confidence in the entire financial system. Ponzi's legacy extended to the wider securities market, presumed to be legitimate. As for law enforcement against the Ponzi phenomenon, many, such as writer Matt Taibbi, who exhaustively researched the scandal, conclude inescapably that the SEC must have known Madoff was operating a Ponzi scheme or at least an insider trading fraud. Many now believe the SEC bowed to institutional and political forces, purposefully ignoring the massive fraud for fear of triggering a wider panic. Whereas authorities relentlessly pursued Ponzi once his fraud was suspected, now regulators, many believe, had become integral to cover-up. While getting much less attention, the Ponzi phenomenon on Main Street, including small and rural communities, is expanding as calculated frauds and as desperate speculation. such as real estate flipping, lottery ticket buying, day trading stocks, gold and silver trading, and cryptocurrency buying. One of the more tragic and illustrative instances was the Pigeon King Ponzi that ravaged family farms in Canada and Northwest USA in the early 2000s. Canadian businessman Arlen Galbraith began selling breeding pigeons and offering to buy back the offspring. With the plan's legitimacy seemingly upheld by authorities, Galbraith's offer was seen as too good to pass up by small farmers struggling to survive selling poultry and pigs. Though the price Galbraith charged for breeder pigeons was as much as $500 a pair, he contracted to pay $50 per offspring. Within a year, the entire initial investment in breeders could be nearly recouped, with the later years' operations yielding almost 100% profit. Galbraith was hailed as the farmer's salvation. Excited farmers took the proposition to local banks for loans to buy in, putting up farmlands and buildings as collateral. Bankers looked no further than the prices paid by the farmers for breeder pairs and contract prices Galbraith would pay for the offspring. Galbraith's plan, Pigeon King International, spread across Canada like a mania and started also to enter the USA. One salesperson for Galbraith personally brought in more than 100 farmers. Some farmers unwittingly lured neighbors and family into the swindle. Contractual long-term obligations of Pigeon King were exceeding $1 billion. Galbraith's plan, like the plan of the inventors of multi-level marketing, had the same lethal flaw. The business was not based on market demand for the products, pigeons in his case. Rather, it depended on an endless chain of new investor breeders. Where was Galbraith getting funds to buy back the newly bred pigeons at such high prices? Bankers did not ask that question, just as few have asked where MLM gets its funds to pay unlimited income to its endless chain of recruits. Canada's Competition Bureau, equivalent to the FTC in the U.S., which regulates business opportunity schemes, apparently saw no cause for inquiry into Galbraith's amazing income offer. Ontario-based freelance fraud investigator David Thornton, publisher of crimebustersnow.com, immediately saw the implausibility of the scheme. He began calling out Pigeon King as a Ponzi scheme. He warned banks and farmers of the flawed business model. He called on Galbraith to reveal his external market for the multitude of pigeons he was contractually bound to buy. He also alerted Canada's Competition Bureau. Thornton was threatened with lawsuits by Galbraith and called a fearmonger by farmers. He was dismissed by the news media and ignored by Canadian law enforcement. His questions finally led to a news investigation not from Canada's news media, but Better Farming, a small trade magazine. Mainstream news inquiries then followed. As became evident, Arlen Galbraith had no market for the pigeons. The money to pay returns came from one place, from the investment money of the later farmers. Every new breeder investor generated the absolute need for many more breeders in order for Galbraith to pay for their pigeon offspring. Meanwhile, the total number of pigeons being bred was multiplying exponentially. Tragically, when the plan collapsed, the farmers were financially ruined, with some suffering foreclosure by the banks. Millions of pigeons faced starvation. Having a true market value of about $2 each, many were gassed or just released. Television news scenes of farmers personally wringing the necks of hundreds of pigeons serve as an unforgettable metaphor for the inevitable outcome of the last one's end. It also revealed the irrelevance of products and other props used as money transfer vehicles in pyramids and Ponzi's. In December 2013, 5 years after he declared, quote, bankruptcy, Galbraith was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison for fraud. In July 2016, a loophole was found in Canadian law enabling Galbraith an early parole release. As Arthur Leff argued, the newly invented industry of multi-level marketing, now raking in as much as $30 billion a year from a churning base from as many as 20 million U.S. households, is the direct descendant of the original Ponzi scheme, with minor mutations, as are all the various Ponzi formats in stocks, pigeons, and mortgages. The 2008 banking collapse that destroyed Main Street equity, the Madoff fraud that exposed the rot of Wall Street, and the pigeon fiasco that wiped out farmers in Canada could be seen as the revenge of convicted and deported Charles Ponzi, and the global MLM phenomenon his triumph.